Welcome all to this webinar around testing, and I have one main goal here, which is showing a minimalist way of testing event-sourced applications. What do I mean by minimalist? Is getting rid of all infrastructure code. People tend to have to create a lot of infrastructure code just to be able to test their system. And this can cause problem to me, because when I'm looking at that kind of code, I'm more interested in the infrastructure code than the domain code. And this is wrong. I should be more interested into the domain code, how it is exercised, what it does, and tests should show me how the domain works and not how the infrastructure works. Not that the infrastructure is not important. This is an important part of any system, of course, but this is second to what does the domain do, and especially when we are at the beginning of a project, because if I'm trying to write a lot of libraries to help be able to exercise the code in all sorts of way, then there's something wrong, because there's a lot of churn normally in the beginning of a project, and I want to show, no, this is simple and can be done in a simple way. There's also a lot of questions that comes always here at Event Store, is like, how do I mock Event Store client connections? Which is strange, because Event Store being a database, the same question would not be asked if it was about a relational database. So those are the things that come up in event source application. So there is some theory, some explanation of why I'm doing some things the way I do, and there is some code which is C# but should be readable enough to anybody, especially the test code, because that's a goal. It should be easy to set up, easy to test what we have to do, what we have to test, and easy to understand why certain things work in a certain way in my domain. But first, I'm not sure what people know about oops, did I lost my connection? No. Okay. What people know about event sourcing, just a quick reminder that event sourcing is not something that has to do with the application itself. It does, but it's just a way to store state in a series of meaningful business events. Nothing more, nothing less. That's it. So if we look what I mean by business events, this is the domain I'm going to use. I'm going to explain it a bit later, but I have some meaningful events, and I should be able to reconstruct the history of my changes in those systems just by reading what happened. So here I have something called an assessment. There was some tau test imported. A version was available, a Word version was available. Some version was activated, deactivated, archived, and then for another assessment, it was added manually. Some tau version was made available, and then there's some versions that have been activated. This should be easy enough to read for us. This should be easy enough to read for our domain experts or users or anybody who helps us building our system. So the goal is to have something as simple in those tests. But of course, systems are more complex than that. We have different parts in an application that is built on top of event sourcing. I have a few entities, let's say, or rules that needs to be immediately consistent. I have integration with external systems, those purple system things over there. Those will create domain events. Those domain events are fed into Readmodels. most of the time used for UI, but also into a reporting database or even an Excel file if you want. And I have some reactions, so things that happen later. So something happens in my system, and then I need something else to happen somewhere else. Typical example, if I have a user registered or a user has done something in the system, please send a mail with this is the form to complete your registration, which is a simple form of reactions that you can have. So those are the different parts of the system, and we need to test them all. This is also showing commands and domain events. Commands are just operation I need to do either on an external system or on an entity. And of course, a user can trigger commands as well, but commands can be triggered by reactions as well. This is a slightly modified version of Alberto Brandolini's the picture that explains almost everything. There are other ways to represent that. This is from event storming, but you also have event modeling to try to visualize what's happening in your system. So if you look carefully at the previous slides, each of those components has some input and some output. And this is how I'm looking at a system in general and how I try to test event source system. I'm interested in the inputs and the outputs. I'm not so interested into, when testing, how that part is actually working. I'm not interested in the internal. So most of my tests are black box. Because remember, it all goes through events. So outputs will be most of the time domain events. Inputs will be either domain events or events to go, and commands. And those inputs and outputs can be piped together to form something rather more complex. I try to not get into that kind of complexity because it's annoying to test. But again, if I need to build to test that full component there, I'm only going to, sorry about that. I'm only going to have like those inputs. It happens inside, and then I'm going to check that the output is exactly what I expect. So if we take part, entities and consistent rules. If we look at the picture that explains everything, I'm sending a command. Something is happening, some code is fired, and the output are domain events. And of course, that entity has some state. So if I look from a testing perspective, the inputs are commands, but also events, because I need to rebuild my state, and the outputs of my entity, or what I'm going to check, are events as well. So given some kind of history, when I'm doing some action against my my entity, I expect those events to come out. This is exactly the same here. Just don't forget, I need to set up my state here. So I'm going to show some code, but I need to quickly explain the domain I'm going to use, which is a real one, but highly simplified. And it's about assessment, portfolio management. This is in the context of in the domain of mass recruitment. We had a change of the platform that delivers those tests to people. So people who wants to take a job needs to pass some tests. They enroll in those tests, they are presented those tests, and they succeed or fail, then get a job or not. And we needed to have a better portfolio management over there. for the question there, I'm just going to answer that in a minute. So just to make a fuller picture, in that domain, I have assessments. Assessments can be created by a user. They can be created by an integration with a third-party platform. They have versions on different platforms. They can be active. There's only one active at a time. They can be archived. And just to restate that differently, I have assessments. Assessments have version. I have different platforms, Tao, Word, Pearson's, Edumatic. For people who ever have had a certification, you have to think people come into, it's the same. People come into a room, they get some tests presented in some platform, and that's those are those platform, Tao, Word, Pearson's, Edumatic. What I will also need in this demo is I will need to know what are the active assessments. This will be a read model. I will need some import because when a test is, or when an assessment is created in one of those platforms, I need to create an assessment automatically. And then I have some integration with third-party or subsystems that are not under my control. And this is just part of some bigger system. So I'm just going to switch to new share, Visual Studio share. I have this famous assessment entity where I can add one, which will be a manual add. I can have an import on it. I can have a Tao version added to it. I can have a Word version added to it. I can activate one of those versions. I can deactivate one of those versions, and I can archive those versions as well. And I can set some target language. Entities have states, if you remember this green little box. And the state I have here is a bit complex, too complex for the demo, but again, this is too complex. I mean, in reality, it's more complex than that, but everything is stripped away. And basically, I need to know if either it's archived, if it has a target group language, because those tests are taken by people French, Dutch speaking, and we need to present the correct test language to assessment language. And I need to know if it has some platform specific version. So how do I test that? I need to go to the correct thing. I have different versions, so we are going to go step by step. In the previous life, this is how I tested my entities. I created it, I set it up something, and then I exercise some operation on it, and then I expect some events to be present as output. This works. This is okay, but I'm exercising the command directly here, which is a bit strange. This does not work when I forgot to do something, and I'm going to show exactly now why this does not work. I have my assessment, and this is still in my range or given part. I have an assessment that was manually added. When I add a tile version, I expect those two events to be present. Now, I forgot to do this in my setup. and my test fails, and this is annoying. There's also something else that is really annoying about those. This is not readable. The same kind of test here. Didn't forget to clear my changes, but I'm doing an arrange. I'm adding a tower version as well, and then I assert again. So let's make it a bit more readable. I'm going to have some scenario, and it's going to specify exactly what's happening. Given nothing happened to my assessment, when I'm adding a new one manually, I expect this only. I'm running my specification and then asserting that my results are okay. This is fine. There's different version of it, but this is still not readable by business users. So let's try to do something better. The code will be available, by the way. Version 3. The same. I have a scenario. I have givens. I'm activating something here, then I expect only, and I'm just running my test. Kind of the same here. I'm going quickly over it. The last version of it is given a scenario for assessment, and given that this was the history of my test, of my assessment, sorry, when I'm activating it, then I only expect a version to be activated. And we can have lots of those tests. Those tests are more reasonable. The big difference here is that I'm only asserting. The thing you can do to let this evolve a bit further is all those givens here, all those events, I'm manually typing them. And in the course, this would be this thing in the beginning of the project. But as the project advances, there will be more tests. This is annoying to type. So I would create some list of events that puts a certain entity in a certain state and that I can reuse them. The nice thing is once I have that, because this interface here or this type of test allows me to pass multiple events. So those events can come, now they're manually added, but they could come from a real database. They could come from the file system. They could be generated, or they could be just pre-computed somewhere, or just randomized. So the goal here, don't forget, is given some history, when I'm doing something, I expect only this. And sometimes I expect nothing. I'm not sure I have a version here where I expect nothing, but that's basically it. And this is quite simple if you look later on in the way I'm setting these tests. This is just my scenario. This is simple code. The only thing a bit strange is this one, which is making a nice way of showing the difference, because I'm trying to find one with 2. Let's say I'm expecting here 2 stuff. Oops. This is just to show, this is a bit small probably for you. I'm sorry about that. It's expecting 2 events and it only got 1. If you want to use some library that does that for you, it's all right as well. As long as we have a given this is what I expect. Given this is how the world looks like before my test, when I exercise my entity, I will get this. So yes, I'm mostly doing that manually or through some download of production data or some test data that is generated for me. I'm just going to correct that because I don't like when it's red. Switching back to the slides. Readmodels. Readmodels. Only input is domain events, but they have some dependencies. Is that Readmodels projections are putting data somewhere. So those kind of tests will become more complicated to set up, because given a list of domain events, I need to be able to talk to some data store, and I need to be able to extract that data from the store later on. So again, a simple way to show that is, sorry, I'm going to switch back to Visual Studio. Let's have a simple read model. My active assessment version. I'm using SQLite for as a storage mechanism. Could be something else. This is the definition of this is what's happening in my projection. When there's a version activated, either insert or update some row in my database. When there's a version deactivated, just remove it. I just want a list of active version, and this is how the tables look like. Just to prove that this is actually working, I'm going to do a small change here. And you can see that there's a bunch of tests that are failing now because this is not the expected state. So how am I doing the first version of this? I create my projection. I have something that allows me to connect to my SQLite. I have my connection to my data source. Oh, sorry, the projector is a way to host my projection. So we'll get events in and dispatch them to the correct handlers. And I'm just waiting a project. I can create a schema here. That's a small trick, by the way. You can have control commands in your projection as well. This is handy when you're doing SQL stuff, relational database stuff. So I have a bunch of expected data. I'm awaiting. I'm doing my projection, so I'm sending those to my projection. I'm extracting the value, and I'm checking that those values are equal. Again, this does not read so nicely. So I have a second version here, which is largely inspired by something that Yves has built a project. I'm saying, hey, given I'm creating a schema, or the schema needs to be there. Given I have a version activated, given I have another version from something else activated, please verify this with this code. So I'm extracting the data, I'm checking that this to my expectations and the actual data is correct, and then I'm just returning okay or not okay. A lot of codes. Last version, I'm going to skip that one. This is basically the same. Is given some input, given I have a schema, given my version is activated, given something else is activated, then with this way of extracting the data, this is what I'm expected. And you can have a bunch of tests that works like that. Again, all those given could be auto-generated, could be taken from a real production database, could be taken from some test database that you have and get a connection. The thing is here, the only real system that is behind the scene is an in-memory SQLite. If you have some other target like a MongoDB and so on, you can of course use a Dockerized way of, or containerized way of spinning it up and killing it afterwards when the tests are done. Just to show something, here in those tests, I'm exactly saying this is what I expect. I expect this in my rows. What I can do also other type of test if needed. So in this case, I have given a version is activated, given another version has been activated, and I'm receiving this message twice for some reason. I'm not obliged to test that all the properties are okay. In this case, I just want to be sure that in my target table, there's only 2 rows. So I will just have another extraction, which will just count the version, the number of active assessment version. And this is what this does. So depending on your needs, you can extract in some way or another. Those tests will, in my case, will mostly stay the same, but they will evolve at one point in time on the extracting side. The extracting side, instead of being some custom code I wrote like this, they will become query handler. So I will send a query and I will get some data, and I can then check and my projection that it does what it needs to do, and that the query handler also does what it needs to be done. Do. Let's say I want to create something that says, give me all versions that begin with RNJ 0. I can create something like a query handler, selects from active version where like begins with. So I can test both and the projection and the query handlers. There's a question I saw there. In this project example, do you run SQL queries in dense section? No, I don't. Yes, actually, no, I don't. This is just, the den is just giving me a method back, which will be run. So my scenario is just telling me, okay, give me some way to find the handlers, the projections. Those are the events that I need to apply to that projection. It's going to build it up in the given. When I'm saying then, I actually create something, a function, which is a specification. And this is just a function. It's not run at that moment. It's only run when I actually start the projection host, I'm projecting to it, and then I run the verification process. So it's only when I run it. And in this code, I run it when I'm doing my assert, which allows me to eventually have something like this. to create a specification, create a scenario that can be reused, and then specification scenario dot, then with a way to extract and then just do my assert. So it's really at this point in time in the test that the thing will be run when I need to await it. So it's only at this point in time that really the code will be executed. The projection code will be executed. This is just preparing my test.
There was also another question from Jakub, but it was about the first part.
Yep.
It was, how do you test compacting of events in entities? I'm not sure whether you want to handle that now or after the...
Maybe after, because I'm not sure what you mean by compacting.
Yeah, so Jakub, if you could maybe elaborate on the compacting part, and then we will get back on the Q&A part to answer that.
Yeah. So again, there's the only code I needed to write for this is a little, I'm not going to call it framework, but seed work, prefer that word, for my projection, which allows me to test it easily, and some minimal work done for creating the projection themselves, which is, you see, 69 of code. Testing part is unfortunately more, hundreds. And I have a fully functional projection and way of testing my projection. Just gonna drink some water. So pretty easy, and in my opinion, gives a nice way to have readable tests that you can expand on. Back to the slides. I'm always clicking the wrong button. We had some code. Reactive components. I went overboard with that sample, I must be honest. Most of the time, in real event source system, or the ones I've saw in the wild, is there are a lot of reactive component that will just take a trigger, one trigger. This happened, then do that. Testing those is pretty easy. It's the same as testing my as sending that message, having the code do the work, and then checking that some external component has been called or not. Now there are cases where those reactions are more involved, especially when we have coordination between different external system and different entities inside our own code base, inside our own data. So reactive components in general, they have as inputs events, dependencies, and output commands. And everybody jumps now on saying it's a command, so I have a command handler. I'm going to add a but. Is that the particular coordination I'm going to do is only working on events? This is a bit more involved. I have some external platform called Tau. This is the real name of that platform, by the way, which is able through a webhook to say that there's a delivery that has been published. When that happens, I have this QTI import thingy here, which is the state I need to coordinate some action between different parts of my system. So I have a delivery published. It will get served into my reaction that will say import is starting. When the import is starting, it will ask some external component, hey, please download QTI from Tao. QTI is a specific format for tests that you can take. And we'll say, when it gets an answer back from this component saying, okay, I'm doing the work, it will say, oh, the download has started. This piece of code here, which is a thin layer of integration, will tell my import process, hey, it has been downloaded or not. But let's take the good part, it has been downloaded. Once it has been downloaded, I need to extract some meta information. Once that extracted meta information has been performed, I need to tell my assessment, hey, there's a Tao version available. Once that Tao version is available here, that's when that import process is considered finished. So those two events, purely from a modeling perspective, are the start and the end of what we consider our import process. This sample is a bit complex. In reality, it looks different because there are lots of other things happening in that real system that have to do with timing and the fact that we are not downloading exactly what people expect that we are downloading. So we need to do some timing checks and stuff like that. But this is the most simple thing. If I look at it from another perspective, one import will look like as, oh, there was a delivery publish, an import was started, something was downloaded, metadata was extracted, there's a Tao version available, and that QTI import is successful, done, and on what it's actually working on. If I go back to Visual Studio, what I'm interested in, especially at the beginning of those tests, is making sure that I have progress on that import. If I look at the import itself, this is my QTI import, so the instance of that process. I can start it, I can say it's successful, I can say it's please remember that it was started, I can register that the thing was downloaded, or that the download failed, and I can extract metadata. The code doing the management is look like this. When I have a delivery publish, I'm going to tell the import, oh, start. Then that thing dies. Later on, I get, oh, the import has started, so I need to download it from Tao. And since this is an out-of-process component that's being used, I get an archive ID, and I'm saying, okay, download has started with this archive ID. Later on, I will receive the fact that it has been downloaded, and then I can begin extracting metadata from it. Once it's extracted, I can tell my assessment, hey, you have an import. This is the information you need. And when my assessment test says, okay, I have a new version available, we say to our own import, we say to ourselves, this is successful. What's important to note here is that at no point in time, I'm having two entities being talked to at the same code base. So I'm not doing load the assessment, do the stuff here, and then right away the import is successful. Why? Because there are separate streams, which means not in a transaction. So this is a way to coordinate transactions between entities. So how do I test that kind of thing? And you will notice that I am not building for that one a specific library for my test. I'm just saying, okay, I have a store, so I need to load my state. This is how you're going to load your state. I have my import, and I'm just saying a tau event has been delivered. Delivery has been published. This is specific to that specific terminology to that platform. What I'm interested in is being sure that the next event to make, which is in this case the fact that the import has started, is in my history of this process. So those are not anymore black box tests. Those are more gray tests, gray tests, because I need to actively look into the changes on my import. And the same for the rest. So I'm setting up quite easily here, go to definition. I'm setting up an import in a certain way. So I can say, okay, this is the state of my import. When I'm trying to load that specific import instance, I will get that one in a certain stage. In a certain state, sorry. And then I can begin to test everything that I need. This type of test, why am I not making any syntactic sugar for, or this type of component, syntactic sugar for that kind of component? Because there are few of them, actually. I think in the whole system that we built for that one, there are probably 2 or 3, while we have way more read models, way more entities, but there are only 2 or 3 components that are doing this. So it's not worth the effort of having something more nice than this. This is readable enough, and it's probably not going to be read or seen by any business people when there is a problem with that one. And thing to notice, any dependency has a test double. Most of my dependencies here in this case are from are based on delegates. But if you look at this method, I'm just calling an operation that I get as a dependency. So how do I extract metadata is here. How do I get that QTR archive is here. So I can control in my test, I can control how those will respond. And I can create tests that will say, okay, what happens if that QTR archive is not existing or has been destroyed or is not there? What happens if that extract of metadata is going wrong because it's actually doing I/O since it's in a zip archive? So there's a lot of I/O going on here, but it's mocked away, which makes it fine because I can actually define the protocol I'm using in my dependencies and my integration components. And it's a way to specify that protocol and saying, okay, this is what I expect when an archive is not existing. I expect, or I will get this kind of error. Last thing that can be tested are command handlers, and I need to find it back because of course I'm so command handlers, most of the time they have this. When we are using command handlers with a message, they will have some commands message. They will take the dependency, and it's the same for that kind of test. I'm going to just load it. I'm going to get the archive. I'm going to extract metadata, and I'm going to store it. If I look at the tests that are covering this one, it's the same. I will make a test double of my store, so the thing that allows me to load my events from a specific stream and transform it into a specific entity. I will call my method, and in this case, since this is the pretty case, there is no assert. What I mostly try to test is when things go wrong. So what happens when I get an error from my archive? Okay, I'm expecting an exception here, and hoping that the application layers above will do something with it. What happens when that specific import is not found? So here I'm having a storeable. What happens when a specific entity is not found? In that case, I'm sending a not found. Okay, I'm expecting a not found exception when I'm calling that handler with that kind of situation in my in my application. Back to the slides. Command handler, we discussed that. So if there's only one thing to remember is trying to go to given when then, trying to have black box testing. So don't really care how my entity works internally. I don't check, for instance, in entity, I don't have state test. Nothing is testing my state because my states can change internally given the needs of the different operation. And I try to focus on inputs and outputs. So what do I need as input? What do I need as output? Inputs is not only events, but it is also dependencies. So I create doubles of dependencies. So in a nutshell, that's how I test things. That's it. Any question? Because I haven't followed the stuff, the chat.
There was a clarification from Jakub.
Yeah.
So let me quote it. You put your entity in a given state by sending it a bunch of events. All of them are finally compacted or reduced to form an entity state. Then a command is sent to this entity. My question is, how can you be sure that you do not have back inconsistencies on applying events to entities? So you do not put it in a state you want it to be. Do you test it somehow?
Yes and no, indirectly. What I'm more, just as I said, I try to not have test on state. I will begin to have test on how the state is applied. So let me share my screen again. Visual Studio. So basically, this code. This code is changing the state of my entity. If it gets complex and that I need to begin to have tests to make sure that everything is okay, I'm beginning to have doubts about what I'm doing. So I will first try to simplify it, which will make clear, which actually will be indirectly tested, because the events I'm expecting have a certain shape. So if I have a good input, I'm doing something, I'm expecting a good output. I don't care how it came to that output. I do care that the output is correct. So what I'm saying here is this is not a nice sample. This should be enough to verify that the internal representation or compaction of the state, that state projection from the events is correct, because all invariants will be also checked. I don't have really invariance here. There's only one, I think, in that assessment is I need at some point let me find it again. Okay, when I deactivate one of those assessments, and I don't have any test for that, that's not good. I will check, is there an active version? Because if not, there's nothing to do. Otherwise, I will apply my events. So if my state is incorrectly set and I'm giving the version back, so please deactivate that version, the output will have, that's a version that needs to be deactivated. I will need to verify that the input and output is the correct one. So here it's probably going to be, instead of version, state dot active version. So given that version, if it's the one that is active, create a new event with whatever state you're in. But most of the time when you are event sourcing such system, there will be small state. The state will not be complex. The state will be reduced to the bare minimum that is needed. So the test you're doing on the outside, are the operation, given that kind of events, given that operation, I'm expecting that out, will be enough to make sure that that compaction you talked about is correct. Is that an answer? Now, there's just for the sake of the argument, this is one way of having my entities represented. So I have a class which is n holding my state, n holding operation I can perform on it. Some people who prefer to do it otherwise, they will just have a bunch of events transform into a state, and then operation directly operated on that state for that given command handler. So for a given command, I have a command handler, which instead of creating an entity, creates a state, applies a function to it, and then you get, again, events back as output. And this will reduce the state really down to the bare minimum needed to execute that command. With this style of code, you will probably have state that is unnecessary for most of the operations you can do on it. That's the strange thing. Other questions?
There is a question from Gavin. Do you test that events are applied only in a certain order?
It depends. So it depends on how I'm feeding those events into my system. I'm going to share again the slides because this is going to be easier, or maybe this one. This is better. Okay. The thing is, on entities, there's one expectation I have is that I will get events in order they have been applied to the stream. So I have something that will load all the events from a stream, do some work on it, and then append back to that stream. I am expecting my store, my database, to give them back in order. That's an expectation I have for any events source database or like event store, but otherwise other also that kind of guarantee. Reactions, the same for read models. I expect them to get events in order 99% of the time, because they are fed. So this is fed directly from a stream. UIs or read models projections themselves are fed from a subscription. So I will get events in order as they are applied, and depending on how your projection is done, it could be that some of those events are failed, so that you can't, for some reason, change the projection model backend store, and this requires different ways to handle. But basically, if all the updates are independent of each other, you could just stop your projection for that particular, let's say, row in the database. I'm not going to update that row in the database because I had an error. And then you will need to replay, but replay will be always in order because my subscription guarantees ordering. Reaction is a bit more tricky. If the reactions is fed also from a subscription coming from one store, I also have actually guaranteed ordering. If that reaction is working on messages coming from queues or from different store, you need to test for out of ordering messages. Nothing else?
Gavin is asking whether immutability is part of the testing.
My store, not really, because the thing I'm expecting for my entities is a certain set of events. And I append those. The immutability is on the side of, it depends on what you mean by immutability. So if you're talking about what has been committed to the store you're using, I expect them to not be changed. Or if they are changed, this is a migration, and all the I mean, it's a migration, so that's a completely different type of problem. What I'm trying to do in my code here, and if you look at the code, you will see that actually I have kind of immutable. I'm using C# record type, which are immutable. So inside my code, everything is immutable. I just get new instance of the same state. It's not the same state, but the same state. But no, it's not immutable. Certainly projection. They are not the store where I'm writing data to is not immutable, because most of those stores don't have immutability in mind. Reactions, it depends on the type of events I'm getting in, but I will have some changes in the rest of the system. So it kind of depends what you mean exactly by immutability here. If it's on code level or on the system level. System level is immutability is most of the time. I appended an event in my log in my database. It stays there forever, which is not true in reality, because I can delete events from my store. I can truncate streams. I can delete streams. So there might be changes in the store. Again, most of those components need to be able to handle those if needed. Oscar has a nice article about that, by the way. It's indirectly.
Yeah, indeed. So Gavin clarified that he was thinking on the scenarios where we need to replay events, but read side needs to handle that.
Oh, replay of projections. If I'm replaying projections, it's probably going to be in a new instance of the target store, be it a new table, be it a new being in a new version, because I have a new version, of being in case of disaster recovery. I will probably replay into a new target table if it's a SQL or target collection or target file. If I'm building Excel files with my projection, which I've done, which is fun. So the thing is with replay events is that I'm replaying events constantly in my test. So probably your system is resilient to replays, or actually you can prove that you can do replays. I think we're a bit over time. So if there are no other questions, I thank you all. If there are other questions or remarks on something that you want to have, I think there will be a feedback form sent. And don't forget, we have a discuss forum. It's discuss.eventstore.com, where you can also ask questions, and we're there to help. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you, Yves.
So I'm gonna stop the Zoom call. So you will be ejected forcibly, which I'm sorry for. But wish you a fine rest of the day. Bye.